Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 237 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. As you are listening to this, we are at Gen Con, but here for your regular entertainment, I am your host, the Orange Tank, Neelan, and with me is the Green Tank.
Yeah, and actually, you have already lied on this episode because I am not at Gen Con. I am the late arrival.
It's we being the royal we.
That's true. And actually, as you might be able to tell, we are two here. We are without Kellen. And in fact, we are attacking Gen Con in sort of a three-wave attack. Kellen is going to be in the Midwest for some work, and so he's going to be at Gen Con, I think, first, right? He's going to be getting there first. He's going to be laying the groundwork. You're getting there after him. You'll sort of set up the base, and then I'm showing up at the end to reap the rewards while doing no work, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Those last-minute reinforcements that no one needs.
Yeah, you can head back home. We never need to.
Yeah. And somewhat relevant even to the idea of conventions and maybe the counterpoint to last week's episode where we were talking about games that we're very excited about at Gen Con. What we thought we would do this week is a topic suggested to us from someone in the Discord, Cap and Jack, and his idea was, I'd love to hear the tanks discuss the games that were once going to be the hobby's next obsession but didn't pan out. So kind of the inverse of that. So stuff that was very, very highly anticipated at one point, but what is the ongoing legacy of those games? Did they make it? Do we still talk about them? Are they still relevant? That is going to be the second half of the show. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the games that we've been playing. And this week, we've been playing Master Word, Living Forest, and Tidal Blades, Heroes of the Reef. Let's kick it off with Master Word. Now, Mark, you have already played this on Game Night.
I have. So people who want to see me play it can go to YouTube and search Game Night Master Word, and you can see me playing it with Nikki, Lincoln, and Dave.
That's as good a way to find out what this game is all about as any. But for everyone else, here's a very quick description. It is a very easy game to explain. It is a cooperative word-guessing game, you know, in the vein of something like a Codenames or a Decrypto, but fully cooperative. Everyone is on the same team. One player is trying to get the rest of the team to the master word. All the rest of the team has to go on is one clue, which is provided by the game itself on the card. And they just have a bunch of cards that they write clues onto. And these clues can kind of be things that they hope will point towards the word. So like the prototypical example, which is on the back of the box, is tiger. The team starts with the clue animal, and they might write, is it a predator? Is it furry? Does it have spots? Does it live in Africa? So these can be questions, these can be clues, these can be descriptors. They can be anything, really, as long as they think it's going to help their team get towards the correct answer. Once they lay them all out in a row, then the guide, who knows what the word is going to indicate by tokens how many of those clues they think are good clues. And very importantly, not specifically which clues are good clues, but only how many in that row. So let's say you have 5 cards in this row. The guide puts out 2 tokens. You know 2 of those are good clues. And then there becomes a little bit of, well, okay, if it was this animal, it can't have been a 2 because it also applies to these clues. There's a little bit of deduction going on to try to figure out what you can eliminate. And you're going to use that just to go straight into the second round. You write 5 more words down. You put them in a row. The guide indicates which of those are good clues. And you continue until you guess the correct word. Importantly, though, you only have 3 guesses that are like on these solution cards, and one of the twists that's quite fun is that if you ever put the solution onto one of your clue cards and not a solution card, it's instantly game over. So you can't just take shots in the dark at like what you think it might be, because if one of those turns out to be correct and it wasn't a de facto solution, you've lost. And that's basically the whole gist of it. You have about 6 rounds to do this, and then the game is over. And you rinse and repeat. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to play. You rotate the leader, and I thought this was a good time. I like cooperative deduction, and I thought this really kind of worked pretty well. Mark, how did you like Masterword?
Yeah, I think the thing with Masterword is that it's sort of in a genre where there's like a glut of good options. Like there's so many good word games that they all sort of in a weird way, in an unfair way probably, feel weakened by how many good options there are. Like if you want to play a good word game, there you have so many good options that it feels like you've got Decrypto, you've got Codenames, you've got Just One, you've got Letter Jam, which is sort of a word game with deduction mixed in as well. And so there are just so many choices that it feels like because there's so many good choices, it really, really, really needs to rise to be classified as like cream of the crop. But I really enjoyed Masterword. It's a completely solid, easy to teach, fun word game that I would play whenever it was offered. It's very, very fun.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that if this had come out 3 years ago, it would have been a classic. And funnily enough, you didn't even mention the one that I think is its closest comparison, which is So Clover.
Yes.
And this is one that came out last year, which is very much about having clues to point you to specific words with all the entire team working cooperatively. And in my mind is a lot more fun than Masterword. Something about just like the presentation of So Clover and the way that you're just forced to discuss and fiddle these cards around just feels more tactile and interesting, in a way that Masterword doesn't quite capture. But again, to your point, that's not really Masterword's fault.
Right.
It's just in this very crowded space. So yeah, I think that this is good. I don't think it necessarily rises above all of the rest. But who's to say if this had been like the first of its type,
Right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, that is Masterword by Scorpion Mask.
And again, for anybody who wants to watch me play it, you can actually go to the Masterword page on BGG, and there's a little game night link, and you'll see me pose in my very thoughtful thinking pose on the intro page. So there's a visual component that adds to the enjoyment you'll get from learning about Masterword.
You are very much a poser, Mark. We know this about you. But let's move on to our second game, which is Living Forest. This just recently won the Kennerspiel. So if you're not familiar, the Spiel des Jahres are a German board game award presentation, and the Kennerspiel is their reward. I believe literally means thinking game. It's the closest to like their hobbyist strategy game award, and Living Forest was their winner for 2021. So it's obviously had a lot of buzz. It's also had a semi-recent release on Board Game Arena, so a few people have now been playing this. We both had a chance to play this recently separately. So let me tell you a little bit about what Living Forest is all about. It is a push your luck race game. The way that you win Living Forest is by being the first to complete one of 3 different race objectives. So without going into too much what all of this means, that could mean collecting 12 fire tokens, representing you putting out the fire in the forest. This could be collecting 12 sacred flowers, which will either be on cards that you're collecting or on trees that you're planting. Trees are just tiles you're collecting. Cards are part of this deck building component that forms the majority of the game. The third way you can win is aforementioned trees. If you have 12 different trees in your forest, you also win. And it's effectively just a race. The first person who at the end of a complete round has done one of these objectives, so 12 in any of these 3 paths, wins the game. There are some tiebreakers if multiple people do, but primarily that's the way you're going to win. And the way that you're accomplishing this is through this deck building system where you have a starting deck of cards, and on your turn, you're just going to lay them out until you choose to stop or you bust. So some of these cards have these little black marks on them, and if 3 of those come out, you've bust. You get to keep all of your accumulated symbols, which is what you're playing these cards out for, but you only get to take 1 action on your turn. If you decide to stop, though, you get to take 2 actions in your turn, which is probably what you're going to want to aim to do, but not at the cost of getting as many symbols as you want on these cards, because that will determine the strength at which you can do all of these actions. And those actions are going to be very much related to all the things I just spoke about in the objectives: getting more cards into your deck, getting trees into your forest, getting more of these sacred flower cards, and putting out the fires, which are these fire tokens that people are effectively fighting over to collect. So it marries a little bit of that push your luck style system from something like a Quacks of Quedlinburg with this sort of interesting race setup, and it does it in a very lovely little production. Mark, what were your thoughts on Living Forest?
I'd be interested, first of all, did you play this in person or on BGA?
I played this in person.
Okay. I enjoyed it on BGA. It didn't knock my socks off, but it's a very, very pleasant game. I think a couple of things that I really enjoyed. I like games where there's a race component because you feel like you have a target. And it's interesting that you have 3 different potential targets to go after here. I sort of like that. And it's not necessarily a situation where you need to be going after one, and if you need to change course, you're messed up, because you'll find yourself getting towards all 3 targets basically at the same time. Like you'll want to focus on one, but pivoting is not out of the question, which is nice. Another thing I really like about it is the fact that a lot of it is simultaneous play. Like when you're doing your own push your luck thing to see how strong you can do these different actions, and you're doing it all at the same time. And It just cuts down on the wait time, which I really enjoy. And again, it's a game where you're engine building, the cards that you're getting that are stronger and stronger just is a pleasant feel. You feel your deck getting stronger. A nice touch is that any card that you buy goes on the top of your deck. So you buy cards and you know immediately you'll get them. So just another positive reinforcement sort of thing. Again, for all that, the game didn't necessarily blow me away. I've only played it a couple times, but it feels like there are a couple paths that are stronger than others. Who knows, really? But for as quickly as it plays, at least on BGA, I enjoyed it. I would be curious to see how much the setup sort of hurt that. I don't know if you found that to be cumbersome at all.
No, not really. Actually, because I think the storage solution that they have fixes that a lot. So in the physical production, I think what would be the biggest setup burden is the trees, like all of the different protection trees. But they have these lovely little cardboard holders that you assemble that you can literally keep the trees inside of the box. So yeah, you just take those trays out one by one and it's basically all set up. And the rest of the setup is not that bad. I am curious to gauge what you think the strongest paths are. Because if they're the same as mine, then I think I could definitely agree that there is. Perhaps, I'm definitely not prepared to say, definitively. Yeah. But yeah.
It feels like to me the fire path is the strongest path. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that would be my take. Interestingly enough, in our first game of this, multiple people were close to finishing the fire path, but the tree path ended up clinching it.
Oh, interesting.
Right at the end. So I found those fairly comparable, but I think, and maybe you'll agree with this, the flowers kind of just seemed very hard to complete.
Yes, I would agree with that. That was the one that I least sort of focused on because it just seemed tough to accomplish.
And there's kind of two things to that, right? Which is you need to both acquire the flower cards and get lucky in your card row in order to have them all come out at the same time. So yeah, that one, I'm very curious to see if someone that has focused entirely on that path would have that bear out. But I do think that your point about that being multiple race objective is key, right? Because the thing that happened in our game that I thought was really fun was you see someone getting close down one of the paths and then you try to stop them, because there is a very inbuilt mechanism where if you hop over another player in this little circular path, you get to steal one of their effectively victory points away from them. And if you do that at the right time, you can just steal victory away from someone. But then you have to keep your eye on another person who's going down a different path. And it just became this game of sort of trying to stop other people just in time so you can take it away from them, which I thought was really cute, really fun. I do agree with you. I think it's a little bit slight. I don't think it really lived up to a lot of the games I might immediately compare it to, such as other race games, other push your luck games. Right. I feel like I still prefer Quacks of Quedlinburg, which is probably a pretty close comparison.
Can I tell you a push your luck race game that I've recently been playing that I liked earlier, but now that I've played it more, I am just loving, is Automobiles. You ever played Automobiles?
Oh, I love Automobiles. I've only played it on Board Game Arena.
A good game.
Yeah.
It's such a good game.
Totally.
I've been playing Automobiles campaigns on BGA, and it's just so good. It's so good. That's such a great game.
So that's funny. I'm also curious. I thought you were going to say Cubitos, which we have not spoken about. But that is a recent favorite in that push your luck race genre, which I still would like to try. But yeah, I don't think that this is a surprising choice for the Kenner Spiel. Sure. I think it's pretty lovely. I do think it, as tends to be the case with the Spiel des Jahres, there's a little bit of really this?
Right. Yeah.
But not the wildest pick for sure. But that is Living Forest by Ludenote. Mark, you've been playing Tidal Blades.
Yes, I got a chance to play Tidal Blades. In Kellen's honor, I'm going to go with Conan, Heroes of the Reef. This is published by Druid City and Skybound Games, designed by Tim and Ben Eisner, with art and world building, this is on the cover, by Mr. Cuddington, which I have to say is a very cool nom de plume for artists Lena Cazette and David Forrest. Mr. Cuddington, it sounds like a spy. The version I got to play was the extravagant Kickstarter edition, which is as Kickstarter-y as you can get, I think. I mean, it's probably not Foundations of Rome levels, for those familiar with that game, but it's darn close. Really big box. Again, not Foundations of Rome level box, which is insane, but I don't think many games approach that level of box size, but big. Really nice components, beautiful artwork, and to get back to the world building, again, by the one and only Mr. Cuddington, there seems to be a lot of focus aimed at just doing that, building the world. There's a book of lore as well, at least in the Kickstarter edition that I was playing. This game also seems to be the first to take place in this Tidal Blades world, as I know there's a Tidal Blades Part 2 coming out next year. And if memory serves, there might have even been another game already set in the world. I can't recall exactly. While we're here, I want to touch on this world building to say that while I absolutely appreciate the effort that has gone into the world building, it's not really something that really clicks with me. It's not to say that that's a negative or even a neutral aspect to the game. The artwork did all feel cohesive, and I think the world building probably lent to that. I just didn't really have too much interest in doing more than thumbing through the lore book. It's not really what I go to games for, and it's probably part of the reason that like epic campaign games like Gloomhaven don't draw me in more. So just not my thing, but I think it turns out to help the game in other ways as well. As far as the game itself, there is a lot in this game and a lot of things going on. In general, it's a dice building, dice rolling, dice mitigating, recipe fulfillment-ish worker placement game. So a mouthful. How
that's my favorite genre.
Yeah, that's right. You're very specific in what you love. So I'm glad to say there is a single game that fits directly into that. How it works is that you set up the board as a number of modular pieces that look like and are supposed to represent islands in this sort of islandy world of Tidal Blades. And while we're on the subject of setup, it's pretty massive. Definitely a table hog. I didn't get to play Wonderland War by the same company. Did you play that, Neelan?
No.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah, I remember.
Helen's...
Yeah, I remember Kellen talking about it, talking about taking up a ton of space, and Tidal Blades is in the same ballpark, which does lend to a sense of grandness, but is also a lot. I mean, it's just very big. So these islands all have worker placement places on them, and you'll spend your turn going to an island, getting the reward associated with it, and then potentially fulfilling a challenge card that you will have previously acquired, as long as the challenge card you have, the location on the card matches the location you're currently at. These challenge cards are sort of the heart of the game. They'll show a number of symbols on them, and you'll try to match the symbols using your dice. So you'll roll a number of dice equal to an attribute you have that you can potentially raise in the future, which will give you more dice to roll in future challenges. You'll roll the dice as well as this like negative die that will potentially destroy some of the dice you've rolled. And you'll assign successes, and then if you're not there yet, if you have not accomplished on the goals on this card, then you can re-roll the leftover dice as many times as you like, but each time you have to roll this negative, potentially dice destroying die. So that's sort of the risk reward that you have going on. Dice rolling can be an instant turnoff to people who don't like too much luck in their games. I should know, as I am one of those people, but there is a ton of opportunity for risk mitigation in this game. You can protect yourself from that negative die by spending shells, which is the dice mitigating currency in the game. You can also assign die to specific faces by spending even more shells. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. Furthermore, you can always choose to concede the challenge, which means you don't get the victory points or reward associated with it by successfully completing the card, but it also means you don't have to further risk losing any more die. So if at any point you can just say, you know what, I'm not going for it anymore, and you concede without potentially losing more die. There are a bunch of places that you're going to be visiting using your worker placement to get resources or trade goods at the market. And when you successfully accomplish these tasks that I mentioned with the challenge cards, you'll be buffing up your character as far as the number of dice you get to roll, how many dice you recover round to round, your ability to upgrade dice, as well as your ability to draw these ability cards that are specific to your player that you can play to add to the asymmetry of your character. So if you move up this one specific dial, you get to draw cards from this specific deck that's specific to your character, draw two, pick one, and then you have now buffed your character in a way that's unique to just your character and no other character can do it. So it's an interesting way to add asymmetry. You can also go to a spot, one of the worker placement spots is to fight monsters that keep attacking the island. It works the same way as the challenges work, but whereas, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier, with the challenge cards, all the dice that you use become exhausted and they're potentially available again to you. All the dice that you use in these monster battles are lost to you no matter what, which seemed harsh in our experience. Yeah, the rewards for fighting the monsters are generally better, but it didn't seem so much better that, and in fact, in the two games I played of Tidal Blades, we didn't really go there very often, but perhaps there's a way to make the monster angle work. So despite the fact that there is a lot going on with Tidal Blades, it isn't really too heavy a game, especially once you get going. And it's fun to go around and succeed at these challenges and see all these things buff up around you, knowing that even tough challenge cards are doable if you're willing to do a little bit of mitigating. That said, one thing I didn't mention is that there are only 12 actions you're going to be doing in the entire game. The entire game is 12 rounds. Each round you do one action, so you're doing 12 things over the course of the entire game. So when you spend a turn not going after a challenge, it can feel like you're really wasting an opportunity. And if you decide to go around that by just pushing your luck without spending a turn mitigating, it can feel like a pretty wild swing in your fortunes versus your opponents. So like if you go for it, if you just like, forget it, I'm just going to go for it, forget mitigating, and you save a turn mitigating and you fail, and then your opponent does the same thing and succeeds, it feels like you're in pretty different boats as far as like they've become super efficient by taking this risk, and now you're feeling like pretty behind. There's also a bunch of downtime, at least again in my 2 3-player games of it. So I played it twice at 3 players. There are a few checks that you could sometimes do on other people's turns as far as which spot they've gone to, potentially blocking you from where you're going. But there are usually open spots you can go to on every island. And after that cursory check you do of what your opponent is starting to try to accomplish, you don't really care too much about what they're doing. And you can sort of just check out. And basically at that point, you're waiting for them to do their thing. So despite the fact that you're only doing 12 actions in the entire game, our games average in the neighborhood of like 2.5 hours. And you sort of feel that because most of the time you are just waiting. So it's a 2.5 hours. It doesn't really feel like it flies by. All that said, I had fun playing Tidal Blades. With as much as is going on, I can see this being the game for folks with smaller collections that want like a few centerpiece games. I don't think the setup and length of play are necessarily worth it for me, though I can imagine breaking it out once in a while to like wow people with the production. As far as the game itself is concerned, I think I would prefer playing the game that it reminded me the most of, which is Champions of Midgard, which is another dice acquisition role mitigating game that just feels tighter and more interactive while taking less time.
I'm glad you mentioned Champions of Midgard because that is a game that definitely was springing to mind as you were talking about this. It has like a very similar sort of production aesthetic. I've not played that, but is a game that I've just been tempted to try for a long time. And I won't lie, looking at Tidal Blades, like there is something that is very inviting, enticing about this art style. It's very clean. It's just got a very solid production aesthetic to it. And nothing that you described sounds like something that would really put me off, except the downtime.
Yeah. And again, I do not mind 2.5 hour games at all. It's totally fine. But a lot of the 2.5 hours, not a ton, but you can feel that time pass because there's a lot of time where you're just waiting, where you can't do anything. You're just waiting for other people to accomplish your task. You're not really like incentivized to look at what they're doing or plan ahead that much. You sort of know what you want to do and you're just like waiting for them to finish.
Also, like, I feel like that's a fairly tall order for what I understand is like a medium-ish weight game. Like, like it's one thing if it's a heavy game or like a longer experiential game. Even something like a Wonderland's War, right? Like that sounds like a game that maybe justifies being that length. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about this one.
Yeah.
It does put me in the mind of the stuff by Libelud, like Seasons and Dice Forge, like that sort of clean, vibrant aesthetic where that's more about just the joy of the production necessarily than the game itself.
Absolutely. I mean, there's little to fault with the production except for like how much it is. Like some people will be put off by just how much is in there, but it's all done really well. It's all like a cohesive design. But yeah, it's just like, for example, this is a game that's a completely different ballpark, but with Lacerda games, they can go 2.5 hours plus very easily. But on your turn, even when there's not much interaction, you sort of need to spend some of your turn like thinking about what I'm going to do and how I want to do it. With Tidal Blades, you sort of know what you want to do because you only have a couple cards that are challenge cards and a couple places to go. So you sort of know really quickly what you need to do. And there's not much planning because what you're going to do is just going to roll dice. So it's like there's not much for me to contemplate here because I know what I'm going to do and I just have to wait it out. So it's, again, just another thing where you're not even really super engaged for some chunks. It's still fun. The ability to mitigate makes it so that even when you're risking, you're not risking so much. You're feeling okay. And like the buffing up feels great. You're turning all these dials and your character gets unique and weird and powerful. So there's a lot of like good feelings. It's just there's some negatives that I think detract from it. That is Tidal Blades by Tim and Ben Eisner, art by Lena Cossette and David Forrest, aka Mr. Buddington, and published by Druid City and Skybound.
Before we move on, we mentioned this at the front of the episode, but it is now, at the time of release, Gen Con. We're at the show. Well, Mark is shortly going to be at the show. But we will be here this weekend. So if you are around in Indianapolis, if you are attending Gen Con, we'd love to hang out with you. We haven't posted any official details yet, but we will likely be holding some form of meetup, or at the very least, just like, loose game hangouts. If you're in the area, especially after the floor closes and you're looking for someone to play games with, how about you check out our Discord? We have a Gen Con channel with a bunch of people who have already signed up for notifications to be alerted when people are looking for people to play games with. You can do that by heading over to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, find the Gen Con channel, check the pinned note for information about how to give yourself the role, and That way, if someone's hanging around in one of the adjacent hotels or on the show floor looking for someone to play or demo a game with, you'll get a little notification. And while you're there, just hang out and chat with us. Discord's a great way just to talk board games with a huge rabid community of people that love me and also board games. That's at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Let's get into our feature topic. This is a look back at some of history's most anticipated. Yeah, exactly. Some of history's sort of most anticipated games, the ones that perhaps didn't live up to their hype, and maybe a few that there's some that did have a lasting legacy. What we thought would be a good way to do this is Mark and I both independently stumbled upon a fantastic resource for this, which is a compiled list based on Board Game Geek votes by Board Game Geek user Rick Vineyard, whose username is rvinyard, RVINYARD. And if you check his profile page, you can find links to all of these lists going back to 2010 of very heavily user-voted most anticipated games for every forthcoming year. So we kind of went down those lists. We looked at some of the highlights, and I think let's just get right into it. We're not going to go through every single game that's on there, but these are the ones that kind of stood out to us as being interesting one way or the other.
I will say that our motto has been, one of our many mottos is we don't look back, we only look ahead. But with Kellen out of the way, we can sort of break the rules. So while the cat is away, the mice are playing by looking back.
Totally. Yeah. And if anything, this is looking back to help us with how we look ahead. Right? This is a warning for some of this anticipatory hype that we are currently engaging in at Gen Con.
That's true.
So let's categorize back to 2010, and two titles stood out here to us. One which was number 5 on the most anticipated games 2010.
And I just want to say real quick that in going through these lists, we sort of avoided expansions. So this was number 5 on the most anticipated list, but like if you take expansions out, this was the number 3 most anticipated game.
Yeah, and that game is Founding Fathers, which
took the world by storm.
Yeah, we were just playing this morning.
I've abandoned the way that years are sort of done by the world, and I just sort of go, I consider this year 12 AFF after Founding Fathers, and then everything else is BFF, which confuses me when I'm talking about my best friends. I get confused, but yeah.
Do you remember where you were when Founding Fathers was released?
Yeah.
God, it's still so vivid in my memory, man. But yeah, look, I'll be honest with you, Mark. I don't even know what this is. So talk about a fall from grace. But you are at least aware of this.
I am not only aware, I own a copy of Founding Fathers. And again, despite the overwhelming hype, I have never played it. I mean, it's well reviewed. I'm a sucker, again, for historical games. I remember reading about it and thinking that it had some interesting mechanisms. So it's one that I definitely want to play.
The other game that I thought was like really notable on this list, which also came out in the year of our Lord 0 AFF, is Vinhos.
Yeah.
This, by contrast, I think has a very lasting legacy.
Yeah, this was the first big design by Vital Lacerda. He had previously done a map for Age of Steam, but after that, he is now one of like the pillars in the board game design community. He's like Mr. Heavy Game, and it all started with 2010's Vinhos. So I think that is definitely a game that has sort of changed the course of game design history for sure.
Totally. Now, I'm not actually that familiar with the original Vinhos. My understanding is that Vinhos Deluxe has pretty substantive changes, but I'm prepared to say that Vinhos Deluxe is my favorite Lacerda game.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if that's not lasting value, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, agree completely.
So let's move on to the next year, 2011. And one thing that stood out here was the very first most anticipated game from 2011 on this list was Walkstar, which it's our understanding is the first major appearance of a Mr. Tim Fowers.
Yeah. No, I remember hearing about this game back when it was being released. And if memory serves, like Fowers was printing and shipping these games from his house. Like the original version of this was like a clamshell thing where he would just pack the game himself and send it off. So this is a very important game because Fowers has obviously gone on to, Burgle Bros and paperback and hardback and become a big designer for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as it is right now, I'm like currently waiting for the new solo version of Paperback. So Fowers continues to be like super, super relevant today, like very, very successful. And yeah, interesting to see that this started here with Walkstar. I kind of vaguely remember some of at the point that I was entering the hobby, which is around like 2011, like some talk about this, but I don't know that I necessarily know anyone that has played it.
I have had this game. I've traded it since, but I've played it. It's a fun dexterity game.
Okay.
I don't think it ever like set the world on fire, but I do remember there was some level of buzz for sure.
Got it. Another game from this list that I thought was also, again, similar to Vinhos, has just now had multiple reissues, expansions, etc. 51st State. This is one that I did not play when it came out, have not played since, but has always just been in the back of my mind as a game that I absolutely need to play.
Yeah, I think this is another influential one. This was re-implemented a couple of years later by 51st State Master Set, which I think is a very good game. And then also the same mechanisms were implemented in Imperial Settlers, all these games by Ignacy Trzewiczek and Portal Games.
And on that note, actually, probably one of the early Ignacy Trzewiczek games, I would think.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess Porte is about the same time, but yeah, early Ignacy in 2011. Back to the list. Where is it? Talk me through CO2. CO2 is Lacerda as well, right?
Yeah, CO2 is Lacerda's second big game, and also interesting insofar that it is a sort of shared infrastructure / co-op / semi-co-op. I actually have not played it myself, but I know you can play it in a couple of different ways. And yeah, one of the few Lacerdas I have not played, but was later re-implemented by CO2 Second Chance a couple of years later, which I've heard good things about. But yeah, another big Lacerda for sure. And probably one of the most unique Lacerdas insofar as you can play it co-op, semi-co-op style.
So that kind of rounds out the list of games for 2011. So moving into 2012, as we get closer and closer to recent history, I think more and more of these are games that we know and recognize. We're not going to go through all of them, but one I think that we couldn't escape mentioning at the very least from 2012 is Rex.
Yeah, the game that inspired Scythe.
Yeah, well, inspired Scythe, inspired Dune. I think, like, you know,
amazing.
Denis Villeneuve played Rex and was like, I need to make a film about this game.
That's right.
It's incredible how much of a legacy Rex has had.
Pivotal to the industry, for sure.
One of Kellen's absolute favorite games as well, if I'm not mistaken.
That's probably the greatest loss of this episode, not having Kellen here, is because he can't wax poetic about how much he loves Rex.
About it.
But don't fear, I mean, he definitely is a huge Rex fan for sure.
Absolutely. All jokes aside, if you're not familiar with what Rex is, this is the Twilight Imperium themed version of Dune the board game. And I would be very curious to know if there is anyone, especially now with Dune having like re-emerged through Gale Force 9's re-release, if anyone prefers Rex or was the die-hard Rex fan over... I guess the only thing I can imagine is if you are a huge fan of Twilight Imperium thematically.
I bet there are. It would not surprise
me. I know,
me.
totally. I'm sure there are too, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
Because I imagine that if, you know, Twilight Imperium is one of those games that definitely is like, hey, it's a lifestyle game, for lack of a better word. If you love Twilight Imperium, you're making a point to play a lot of it because it's a very big experiential game. And I can imagine that might encourage you to be like, okay, here's another game set in the same universe.
Yeah, and frankly, I've never played Rex, so I can't speak to this with any authority, but I imagine there are some probably changes to the way that Rex is played versus Dune, because Dune is notorious for having a lot of edge cases, having a lot of even ways that people play it. Like, people play Dune with one set of rules versus another set, and I can see some of that being sanded down for Rex potentially, so I can see people preferring it for sure.
I think especially in the context of a publisher like Fantasy Flight doing this in 2012, I imagine this is, to their mind at least, a very refined version of what was a game that we love, but a fairly wonky game back when it was released in June. Also notable in 2012, and talk about something that's had kind of almost like a mythological effect on the industry. Glory to Rome Black Box Edition.
Yeah.
Appeared in 2012 and never appeared again.
This is one of the definite holy grails of games out there for sure. And also the source of my greatest single trade on BGG. I don't know if I mentioned the story, but I got Glory to Rome Black Box from a local person selling it, I think on OfferUp or something, or Craigslist. I think I got it from them in a set of other games. Like, I bought 10 games from this person for like $150, and then I traded Glory to Rome Black Box for, and I've got the list here, Container 10th Anniversary Jumbo Edition, On Mars, Orleans Deluxe, Soul Last Days of a Star, and then Vinhos Deluxe. So...
Too many games.
Too many games. That's right.
I think this is also like been one of the games that's the most notorious for fostering like a make it yourself at home version.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, I myself have my own printed version of Glory to the Rome Black Box Edition because it's so hard to acquire. It is so expensive that the idea of paying that much for one game that you may or may not like sometimes feels absurd. So yeah, the homebrewification that I think evolved around this game.
Also, I think very interesting and very pivotal in the whole Kickstarter part of the industry, because when you have this FOMO for a Kickstarter game, one thing that is, at least in the back of my mind, although I'm usually able to resist it, is that like, what if this is a Glory to Rome Black Box situation? Like, what if this is a game where, and again, furthermore into the interesting historical nature of Glory to Rome Black Box, this is one of the first games I remember hearing about with Kickstarter with this incredible and incredibly sad in a lot of ways, like backstory with like disputes between the designer and the publisher, and how in some way like ruined both of their experiences, sort of along the lines of what you later hear about with Project Elite, where it's like this crazy Kickstarter that sort of got out of control and out of the creator's control, and ended up like being this game where it was such a business failure or business explosion that the game became incredibly hard to get because the publisher had no reason to print more. And it's just interesting in terms of like the history of Kickstarter games, I think.
So let's move into 2013, and I think we can knock through these ones pretty quickly. Kingdom Death Monster obviously has a rabid fan base. It's most notorious for losing me the draft with Shut Up and Sit Down in 2021.
Biggest claim to fame for Kingdom Death.
Yeah, exactly. They put that on the back of the box.
That's right.
Roll for the Galaxy is also out in 2013, which is also notable for being a better version of Race for the Galaxy. So how's that for a legacy?
I will not say anything in the interest of time.
The other standout from here, which was another one that we just looked at and were like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Is Quarantine?
Quarantine. I mean, look, Quarantine comes out in 2020, picks up on the whole pandemic thing. Maybe,
right, exactly.
Maybe it actually...
They were 7 years too early.
That's right, that's right. But yeah, had never heard of Quarantine aside from seeing it on this list. And
yeah,
from what I can see here, it sort of has disappeared to the annals of history.
In 2014, one game that stood out to me as a game that I have been actually genuinely itching to try, and to some extent it's kind of odd that I have not tried this yet, and that would be sort of anathema to Mark's gaming taste, is the sandbox sci-fi game Zia, Legends of a Drift System.
Yeah, one that I'm actually, for as much as I don't like sandbox games, which is true, I feel like that people would say that Zia is one of the top ones in that genre, so I wouldn't mind playing it for sure. I've heard a lot of good things, and this would be a situation where this is a case for successful Kickstarters. Yeah, this is one of the big successes.
As far as successful Kickstarters go, I think the jury is out on Cthulhu Wars, which I think, talking about problematic Kickstarters over the years, definitely one of the top candidates. But yeah, Cthulhu Wars, I think its effect on, I would even just at the very least, us, like it is consistently one of our favorite games when it comes to, you know, our top lists. Kellen being I would say the number one proponent of this game, the person that got all of the rest of us into it, really. Very, very, very cool area control game. Very much following in the wake a little bit of Chaos in the Old World, but really taking that and honing it in a way that just feels really, really fun to play.
Yep.
Always also like a standout at any convention. I think, if anything, if you ever go to any Gen Con or any similar convention and you go past the Pedersen Games booth, there's typically just a massive table covered with Cthulhu Wars features, so very hard to miss.
Yep.
And then a game that, again, not entirely sure where this hype came from and where it went. Myth. Do you know much about this one, Mark?
I do not. I was looking at the page on BGG. It looks like it was like a miniatures-heavy cooperative game. So I feel like it was sort of trying to cash in is maybe too pejorative of a word, on the whole Kickstarter big plastic thing, but it seems like a big plasticky Kickstarter co-op game that just seems to have fizzled out a little bit. I guess it was re-implemented back in 2021 with a Myth Dawn of Heroes, which is well liked in terms of critically. It's an 8 on BGG, but again, another game that I have not heard anything about. And I guess this may not have even come out, because according to the community stats on BGG, only 3 people own a copy of it. So I assume that it maybe has not been released. So yeah, Myth had not heard of.
Maybe one of these victims of Kickstarter shenanigans.
Yes, perhaps.
Ultimately. Talking of Kickstarter shenanigans, let's move to 2015, one of the games that stood on this list, and notable for having appeared multiple times in multiple years. The nature of Kickstarter games is a lot of these times they get delayed. Conan.
Yeah, this has a little bit of a legacy with, I guess the system, this is a one versus many game, and I think the system was called like the Overlord system, where like the energy used by the many is then used by the one. So like if you take a lot of actions, you're basically fueling your opponent. And it was later implemented with not super successful effect with Batman Gotham City Chronicle game. I know that was a contentious Kickstarter a couple of years later. I think they're doing a second edition of it, so maybe it'll find its way. But yeah, there is some legacy for Conan, although the Conan game itself, I think, has not been as widely enjoyed or owned as maybe the hype going into it.
And perhaps not even as much as the Batman follow-up, which I feel like does get a lot of love. So yeah, at the very least, a system that bore out by all accounts, better game.
Yep.
Viceroy also comes out in 2015. I must admit, I have not heard about this one at all, Mark, but you do remember the hype around this?
I do. I don't remember why the hype was there. I think it was maybe like the coattails of like Splendor. Like I think Splendor was hitting its heights back then, and this felt like or was touted as like a Splendory sort of game. I remember it being very, very excited at its release, and it just sort of, this was one of the first games for me where the release immediately sort of dampened the excitement of a game, and it sort of has been lost to the dustbin of history since then. So yeah, Viceroy, remember it being very hyped up, but then in the end, not so much.
Would it be fair to say that this is the birth of the attempted Splendor Killer?
Yeah, perhaps. I don't think we got the term Splendor Killer until we had Century come around, but this might have been the proto Splendor Killer. Yeah, for sure.
Also in 2015, notable for the English release of Mysterium. So now Mysterium had existed as a Polish game 2 years prior, but I think they're based on, I assume, the hype around that version of the game. Mysterium just gets a lot of buzz, and again, a lasting buzz. I feel like people still talk about Mysterium. It has become a very renowned, accessible game that I feel like is on the verge of being, let's call it, outside the hobby. Like, it's, people that are not hobbyist gamers have sometimes very often played Mysterium.
Absolutely. Whenever I bring up games to friends of mine who are not gamers, I'm always interested to find out what games from the hobby they've played. And it's usually stuff like Ticket to Ride or Catan. But more than once, I've heard people say, oh, I've played this game called Mysterium. Have you ever heard of it? So I think it did sort of break out a little bit. I haven't played it in so many years, but I do remember how excited I was to play Mysterium those first couple times. And I really, really enjoyed it. It takes a little longer than I would probably want whenever I've played it, but it can be super, super fun for sure. In that Dixit style.
Yeah. I think it's also very telling that, there are definitely more than a couple of games, and I guess, funnily enough, a lot of these I remember demoing at Gen Con or other conventions that have tempted to come at Mysterium, like Obscurio springs to mind,
right.
Something that was a little bit in the vein of Mysterium. But I think through all of that, nothing has stuck like Mysterium has.
I would agree with that, yeah.
And then probably the most notable game from 2015, and arguably maybe one of the most notable games on this entire list, is Pandemic Legacy.
Yeah.
Which I think very cleanly takes us into our next segment, which was going to be called The Legacy of Legacy. I think that it can't be understated how huge Pandemic Legacy, it just shot what felt like a tidal wave through the industry of games that were now trying to capitalize on the legacy craze. Pandemic Legacy, obviously an unmitigated success. It's still number 2, is that right, on the Board Game Geek top
2
list?
or 3, yeah, something like that.
It had been on number 1 for the longest time. So, yeah, obviously an incredible game that has now spawned 2 sequels, let alone however many countless other legacy games.
I remember, this is super nerdy, but I do remember the day that Pandemic Legacy dethroned Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle was the number 1 game, and Pandemic Legacy dethroned it. And I was like, wow. I mean, I already knew it was huge, but I was like, I couldn't believe it, that the king is dead.
Yeah, and I think what's also wild about that is that despite very much being in the hobby at the time of its release and knowing from everyone having told me repeatedly that Pandemic Legacy is fantastic, and having had an in-shrink copy of Pandemic Legacy since about 2017, I have still to date not played Pandemic Legacy.
I think you would like it. I think it's right up your alley.
I know I will.
Yeah.
I know I will.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's terrible. I've now played 5 different versions of Pandemic, and I still have not touched Pandemic Legacy, which is probably the biggest travesty.
I remember how hyped Pandemic Legacy got me about the whole Legacy experience. I know it's not the first Legacy game. I know that there's been a couple before, most notably Risk Legacy by the same designer, Rob Davia, who sort of was the Legacy guy. But I'll never forget playing it for the first time, and I was playing with people who were non-gamers and who weren't aware of what a Legacy game was. And that first time where we were told to destroy a card, and I just did, I took the card, I held it above the table, and I'm just ripped it right in half. And this is where we're at. This is what we're doing. This game was no holds barred. Anything could happen in this game. And it ended up being a great experience.
There's something that's just so magical about that concept, right? Even just I know this is probably going to set off environmentally minded people, but just the idea of a single-use board game was
sure.
a really novel, it's a very novel idea. The idea that, like you said, hey, you bought a thing, but now we're going to throw it in the bin. There is a power to that mechanically.
There is a feeling anything could happen. For those who are not familiar with Pandemic Legacy, not only are you potentially destroying pieces and cards, but you're writing on cards, you're writing on the board, you're putting non-removable stickers on the board to change how the board is. There are boxes that are sealed that you're only opening at a certain time. So that's it's like a thing where this box could have anything. The rules that we're playing with now could change in the next game. Like this card that you need, this card that you've been, counting on could be destroyed. Like it just, anything could happen. There's like, you had this feeling like what constitutes a board game, where the borders are for what a board game could be, have now shattered. It could do anything now. And that's what sort of kept me in the Legacy is interesting and what Legacy could be for a long time. I've since sort of gone away from that, but I still can, when I think about Pandemic Legacy, when I think about that first card that I tore, it is evocative of a feeling. It's evocative of a level of excitement that I had for sure.
And that feeling would continue to live on in what is easily the most notable follow-on to the history of the Legacy game, also by Rob Daviau. And probably I would say the single game that most came to mind when I thought about this topic personally. Who could forget SeaFall?
SeaFall, that was huge. God, there was so much hype with SeaFall. Like
for years.
Yeah, for years, yeah.
Because it kept getting pushed and pushed, right?
Yeah.
So it felt like it was, again, it was anticipated and it was like, oh, it didn't come out. It would just keep building and building to an impossible degree.
Right. And I remember I had SeaFall. I ordered it from an online board game retailer. It might have been Cool Stuff or something. And I ordered it fairly early before it come out. And it was on my hold list. Like, for those who are not familiar, like when you're ordering games from an online retailer, you can have like a list of games that you're holding until you hit a threshold and then it's released. And the first game I put on my list of games was SeaFall. And I had a bunch of other games there and I was just waiting for it to be released. And I remember I was somewhere and the review for SeaFall came out. I think it was Vassal's review for SeaFall. And like, it was like, this game isn't necessarily super great. And the first thing I did was go to my order and just like take SeaFall off the list and make sure that it didn't fulfill accidentally. But yeah, the story of SeaFall is one of the games that jumped to mind the quickest when we were talking about doing this topic, for sure.
It's certainly like in my memory, I hesitate to say scandal because there's nothing that's controversial about its creation or anything like that. But in terms of just like an event that was so notable just from the merits of the game itself, of like a fall from grace, I can't think of anything that's like more pronounced than SeaFall.
Yeah, absolutely. It did a lot to immediately tank the buzz that had been growing for legacy games. Legacy games had been this like thing where everybody was announcing a legacy game. It was this incredible bubble of excitement. And then SeaFall comes out and it's just like immediately I remember feeling that piercing of the bubble and being like, oh, maybe we should just wait until these games come out and actually see if there's any good. Like maybe the fact that they're legacy doesn't inherently make them appealing or good.
Because that's the thing, right? The entire conceit of like the genre is if you're going to start this, you're going to have to be committed for, 12, 15, 20 games, depending on the campaign. And if you're playing the first game and you're like, oh, is this any fun? I don't think this is any fun. And then you're like, are we going to do 11 more of these?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
It's such an indictment of like the entire concept, right?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly.
And I think that's going to wrap it up for our walkthrough of this list. There are a couple of games that did spring to mind just from like a personal perspective that I do also remember as just being notable. The first of these was Cry Havoc, which, came in at a time where I think fairly recently met Kellen and Mark. This may have been one of the first games that we sort of played together in that era, like around 2016.
Yeah.
Cry Havoc at that point had been very much hyped by Mr. Tom Vassell as I believe his game of the year.
Yeah, something like that. I remember.
It was something like that.
Yeah, that was a game that came out of nowhere and just like almost his excitement alone just blew that game up.
Propelled it.
Yeah,
totally. Sure. So this is an area control game. I do think that the thing that is very novel about it, and to some extent does have, let's call it a legacy, is its battle system, where you are placing the miniatures are in the battle, you're assigning them to this board that is a little bit reminiscent of a much better system in Rising Sun, for example.
For sure.
Where they're assigned determines whether they're contributing to victory points, whether they're contributing to kills, etc. Neat system. The game itself, just weird in it has very intense asymmetry, which I think kind of rubbed people the wrong way because it didn't seem especially well done from an asymmetry perspective. I remember having Cry Havoc and very quickly moving on from it after a few games. The other one that springs to mind is also Founders of Gloomhaven, because talk about like a follow-on game from like one of the most successful board games ever made. I mean, let's call it, by some metrics, the most successful. It is the number one game on Board Game Geek. It has now had a massively successful successor in Frosthaven, which is on the verge of being released. Founders of Gloomhaven is a very different style of game. A game that is following on from Gloomhaven that is not in the same genre, but is very much trying to lean into like the idea of being related to the lore and the context of Gloomhaven. Actually much closer to something like a Great Zimbabwe, a logistics route building game of placing buildings through a city. Kind of just completely fell flat for me and most people, I would say.
I remember enjoying my play of it, but I mean, it's its own game. And yeah, I remember there being hype on it because of that Gloomhaven association, which is, I mean, to call it even tenuous association is to give it too much credit. It's a Gloomhaven game in name alone and no other aspect.
Totally. And actually, I do want to clarify something I even just said earlier. Like, I don't even want to say that it completely fell flat for me. Like, actually, to your point, Mark, I liked a lot of things about Founders of Gloomhaven. I just thought it really, really didn't come together. Yeah. It kind of felt like it needed a huge amount of extra development time just to get its cool ideas to congeal well together. I have actually often thought about Founders of Gloomhaven as a game that could be very successfully re-implemented with just more refinement, maybe a little bit of streamlining in a way that I think would be really, really compelling. But I guess there's also just The Great Zimbabwe, which is an excellent game in the same vein. I think that's going to wrap it up for our walk through some of the most anticipated games of the past and where they are now. How many of those are like you heard of? How many of those are you still playing? Maybe there are some that we mentioned that, you know, we thought have disappeared into obscurity, but people are still super hyped about. Mark, what if someone comes in and tells you that Founding Fathers is the best game that they've ever played?
Yeah, I will just agree with them wholeheartedly. I'll tell them about my calendar system and we'll be best friends. Yeah, but I would love to hear about people's like that first game that was super hyped or the first game that they were hyped about and like the story of what happened subsequently from that hype and from that excitement.
Absolutely. And a good place to do that would be in our aforementioned Discord. That's at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. You can come in, talk about the latest episode, other stuff you've been playing. You can also find us on all of our social media. We are on Twitter. We are on Facebook. We are on Instagram. We have a guild at boardgamebarrage.com/guild. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music. What's in your mind, kid? And that's going to do it for us. Hopefully, we'll see you at Gen Con.
Yeah, find us at Gen Con. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone.